Wizard101, an absolute classic in the MMO space, but one that somehow always evaded my attention. As someone who spent thousands of hours on RuneScape, I can hardly blame the fact that Wizard101 is an MMO which was catered and marketed towards children as my reason for not playing it during this game's peak popularity. Originally released in 2008 by KingsIsle Entertainment and featuring a turn-based, card-focused combat system that sounds like it might be a drag, but it actually features a lot of strategy, planning, and RNG to get right. While Wizard101 claims to be free-to-play, and in this video I most certainly tried my best to remain free-to-play, you'll find that in order to truly enjoy the most out of this game, you're gonna probably find it necessary to pay the $7 per month membership fee, which will grant you access to all of the available worlds and quests, many of which are blocked off otherwise. There's also a whole host of other benefits as well, but that's kind of the main one. While I may have missed this game when I was actually the age of the target demographic, that doesn't mean I can't go back and experience this game for what it was, and decide if I truly missed out on an awesome experience, or if in 2024, 16 years after its release, we find out if it's even worth playing. So let's get into it. In Wizard101, you are a student who is placed into a world to learn about magic and spells. You're introduced to Headmaster Ambrose and his owl, Gamma. They speculate on your existence, and here through a series of questions, you actually choose your class, or more specifically, your school of magic. There are 7 different options from fire, ice, and storm to myth, life, and death, as well as balance, which is kind of a mix of everything else. Through my answers, the game decided that I was most fit for death. I don't know what the game's trying to tell me, but it goes on to explain that the school of death magic is good for newer and solo players, so it sounded perfect for me. Afterwards, you actually get into character customization, which is pretty standard. You can change the look and color of your hair, eyes, mouth, nose, but you can also get face tats, which is kind of crazy because I don't think face tats were actually that relevant in the mainstream culture in the year 2008. It really makes you wonder if Wizard101 had a larger impact on the new youthful generation than we expected. I got a couple of skulls on my cheek to show off that not only was I a death wizard, but also an aspiring SoundCloud rapper. Afterwards, I was introduced to my favorite naming system of all time. You can find a similar system in Toontown, as well as Pirates Online, where basically the game has preset names and words picked for you. This is in order to avoid using anything close to your real name or something offensive. It's basically just a kid-friendly naming system. Now, first of all, the key to a good name is finding some decent alliteration. That way it rolls off the tongue a bit better. Now, normally I would have spent a long time here trying to find out how to make the most inappropriate name possible with the options given, but I've already done that before. So this time I wanted to try something new. This time I wanted to see how many characters I could fit into one username while keeping it alliterative. The answer? 25. 25 characters in my username. Meet Demetrius Diamond Deflector, the Death Wizard, soon to be next star Chicago drill rapper, and most importantly, a new player to Wizard101. I jump into the game and you're immediately introduced to a fully voice-acted tutorial. Actually, pretty much every quest that I encountered in this game was voice-acted, which is always a bonus. The game teaches you to move around with WASD, and you can interact with NPCs and objects by left-clicking or pressing X. Next, after a cool cutscene and a positively hilarious owl joke, you're asked to head into the tower where you're introduced to the main antagonist in Wizard101. Malistaire, the former professor of the School of Death and basically Voldemort. The tutorial then takes you through the basics of combat. Basically, when you start an interaction, you're going to see this giant ring on the ground. There's 8 different spots, and 4 of them can be used by yourself and allies, but the other 4 can be used by enemies. It's a turn-based combat system where you draw and use cards. Some cards do damage, some provide buffs, some provide debuffs, some heal, and some can be used in tangent with each other to do massive amounts of damage. Every time a spell is used, an animation will play, depicting the spell and showing the damage done or negating if the spell misses. Every card has an accuracy rating that is not equal to 100%, so they can fizzle out or miss. Now, really, I've enjoyed plenty of turn-based combat systems in my life, from the earlier Final Fantasy games to Pokemon, but I do wish in Wizard101 that they had a way to speed up the animations, as some of them could take a particularly long time. especially once you start fighting multiple enemies at once with multiple people. There's a few more specific details, such as pips, which you gain each turn from either using a zero-cost spell or passing on your turn instead of using a spell. Certain more powerful cards will require more pips, but all in all, it's very simple, easy to understand. After defeating Malastaire's 2 drakes, my character started doing a victory dance, and Ambrose mentioned that he would fully heal my health and mana. But after he said so, I decided to just let my character continue dancing, while the awkward silence settled in. Afterwards, Ambrose teleports you to his house in Wizard City, and you're finally introduced to the full interface. There's an XP bar at the bottom, a spellbook and compass to the right, and taking a look inside the spellbook opens up the rest of the menu system, of which there are a ton of options from quest journal to inventory to crafting. And then up in the top left corner, you have a few buttons. One of them says to like this video. The other says shop, and the other says upgrade. Now, this is the first time that I was actually made privy to a subscription within the game. But unfortunately, after clicking the button, all I got was an error notification. The shop, however, I was actually able to look through, and just taking a quick peruse, it seems you can purchase quite a lot of beneficial things. From pets to decks with powerful cards, to temporary and permanent mounts, to even gold and new gear, and housing? I did not think this Wizard game from 2008 would have its own housing system, but cool, I'm excited to get into it. Overall, Wizard101 is not necessarily pay to win, but it certainly is pay to play, as about 99% of the content is actually locked behind the membership. We'll get into that later. I have heard, unfortunately, that there can be things considered slightly pay to win in terms of the PvP aspect of the game, regarding certain types of pets and lore spells which can take hundreds of hours, or potentially hundreds of dollars in order to acquire, and those are necessary to be competitive. But all in all, I've seen better cash shops, and I've also seen worse. So let's continue on. I opened up my map for the first time, which showed that I was in an area known as the Commons. It's a friendly area with many connecting areas, some are friendly and some are not. This is where you're going to find the majority of your quests, merchants, trainers at the beginning of the game. After talking with Ambrose and getting my first quest, I was told to check out Unicorn Way and deal with some of the trouble in that area. Once there, I was told to fight a couple of lost souls, and this was actually my first time that I was introduced to my starter deck. As you can see, an NPC will have a type, and so will many of your spells. You want to avoid using the same type of spell against an enemy, and you want to instead use their weakness. However, in the beginning, this hardly matters, as it's mostly meant just to introduce you to your deck and combat. Since I was a death wizard, I had mostly death magic cards, such as this Dark Sprite. After defeating an enemy, you'll get a small amount of XP, though it's usually quite lackluster compared to the amount of experience you get from finishing quests. And on top of that, you can get loot and gold. The game then teaches you about wisps. Basically, health and mana regen is done mostly through these. You use 1 mana every time you use a spell, and health is pretty self-explanatory. By gathering these orbs, which can be located in every zone, you will actually regenerate those stats. Though some zones seem to have a higher concentration of a particular type. Some you'll find more mana, or vice versa. After killing a couple of skeletons for a quest, I was given a ring to equip, which increased my HP by 10, and I also got myself to level 3. Now, leveling up will increase your base health, and at certain milestones, it will allow you to train new spells or equip new equipment. However, just leveling up by itself doesn't necessarily make your attacks or your character any stronger. Not until you equip that equipment or use those new spells. A little while later, while fighting some fairies, another player actually joined my circle. This can happen at any time another player walks over the fight you're currently having. They can now also attack the enemy, however, they can also attract more enemies to join the fight. You'll find Wizard101 can be quite a collaborative experience, as especially on the busier servers, there are usually people fighting and questing in almost every zone. It was pretty rare that I was actually truly alone while playing the game. But this could be due to the fact that I stayed relatively in the intro to the game, and that could change later on in the higher level zones and areas. I'm just not sure. Some further questing rewarded me with a broomstick, a mount that I could ride around and it would make my character faster. The only catch, it only lasts for 24 hours after you equip it. I thought for sure that this would be some sort of teaser in order to make me want to spend real-life money later on, and that's definitely part of it. However, you'll find that you can purchase these temporary one-day mounts for a pretty small chunk of gold from multiple vendors throughout the game. Wizard101 definitely has some charm to it though, as I got another quest telling me to save a lost guard here in Unicorn Way. That guard's name is Orion, and the quest was called Saving Private Orion. Nice. Not long after, I got into what I guess was my first boss fight. It was a fairly simple endeavor. I killed the ad, took on one of the ghosts from Coraline, and afterwards I was given some fancy new boots. But unfortunately, they were meant for a different school of magic, or class, so I couldn't actually equip them. Then I found a higher level character, Xavier Swiftwalker, and I decided to inspect some of his gear. Most of the stats that I could see on his equipped items made little to no sense to me. He looked a bit like a Roman warrior wielding a spear. But I always find it fun to inspect higher level characters when you're a bit new to a game in order to see what you might find in the future. It gives you a goal to shoot for and something to aspire to. However, when I was back in town, not too long after, I found another death mage who was actually level 88. Which put things into a bit of perspective. I did a bit of research, and the max level has changed a few times over the years and with updates, but I'm fairly certain that the current max level is 170. A bit of an odd number for sure, but good to know. I visited the Death School teacher, and he taught me the Ghoul spell, which is the first spell that I have that actually requires 2 pips to use. Not only does it damage the enemy, but it also heals me for half of the damage dealt. Not bad. Afterwards, I was directed to look inside my dorm, which is your player-owned housing. Later on, we're going to have to decorate the heck out of this place, but right now, and fitting with the new college student storyline, I was flat broke. Though inside your dorm, you will find a bank chest for extra storage. Then I was given a full tour of the city where you learn about all of the different areas. You find different NPCs which can train you in fishing, crafting, even gardening and picture taking. All stuff that I was pretty excited to really delve into later on. Next, I was given a rundown of the pet system and given a nice little baby cat. Basically, pets can also do damage to enemies when it's your turn to attack. They serve a few other functions as well in the game, which we'll get into, but they operate on a hungriness scale. While playing the game, you'll find many snacks through combat or questing, which you can actually feed your pet to satiate their hungriness. However, I found while playing that my pet was constantly hungry. When your pet is hungry, they can't attack anything or perform any of their functions. So I'm not sure if I was missing something or using my pet too often, but it was fairly annoying to upkeep. But then I finally ran into my first paywalled area while trying to enter Firecat Alley to complete a literal main story mission. It appears you can either buy the zone using crowns or become a member to access all of the areas. However, I wasn't sold just yet, so I decided to put it off for now and see what else I could accomplish. So instead, I made my way into the ghoulish alleys of Triton Avenue, another seemingly free-to-play area that I could continue questing in. At this point, I was around level 6. The leveling had been exceptionally fast, though it was starting to slow down a little bit. While in Triton Avenue, I stumbled across my first group boss. As you can see, 3 other players could join up with me. However, there was no one around, so I decided to attempt it solo. It actually wasn't too difficult, and I pulled it off, which rewarded me in some new robes. Unfortunately, once again, these were for the fire school, so I couldn't wear them. However, there was also a chest at the back of the room. Though I had high hopes and dreams of more loot, it's actually a monetization strategy where you can use crowns, the purchasable currency, to get a second roll of loot. Now, this chest doesn't seem to be at the back of every boss that you defeat in the game, though it seems to be at most of them. It's kinda lame, got my hopes up, but oh well. I beat another boss, which actually got me to level 8, and also finally got some cool new equipment. Even though this looks just like the Jester hat from old school RuneScape, I was happy with my new plus 28 HP. And then for the rest of the day, I ran into paywalls, I participated in a sort of challenge tower, and I even did get myself some new robes. But that was it for day 1. All in all, while the game has its grievances, I was having a ton of fun, and I couldn't wait to hop on the next day. But before that, screw it, I'm pulling the trigger. I don't want to be locked out of content for tomorrow. So I got myself the $7 membership. And sure enough, the next day with the membership purchased, I was now able to continue some of the main quests. and I made my way into Firecat Alley, which was blocked off before. Firecat Alley, true to its name, has a fiery and orangey red vibe with lots of fire-type monsters to fight. However, while I was here, I wasn't paying much attention during a boss fight and accidentally died. It was definitely an accident, not a skill issue, I promise. But basically, death doesn't really have too many penalties. It reduces your health and mana to 0 and sends you back to Wizard City. But there's actually a button that will teleport you directly back to where you died. In order to take on this boss again, I decided to wait until a group of players were ready to hop in, and we all jumped in together, making much quicker work of the encounter. I got myself to level 10, which meant as soon as I was finished in Firecat Alley, I'd be able to go and train some new spells from the Death School teacher. He taught me about the Banshee, which is a 3-pip ability, but it does significantly more damage than any of the other spells I currently had. At this point, my starter deck was really starting to come together. Also, while I was in town, I decided I would head to the fishing trainer and learn how to fish. Fishing in Wizard101 can be pretty lucrative, and it also has a massive collection system to go along with it. Basically, depending on the type of lure you're using and the area you're in, you can catch different types of fish. Also, while you're fishing, you also have a unique action bar where you can use different spells to help aid you in fishing. At the moment, I only had the one spell, which is basically just casting out your lure. You wait until a fish is on the lure, and when the lure drops below the water, you spam spacebar. And then boom, you caught a fish. It definitely can take quite a while to get a bite, however. Next up, I made my way into Cyclops Lane, which was the next area that I was planning to quest in. I tried out my new Banshee spell, which was an absolute powerhouse. I got myself some hardcore new gear, which looked about as badass as a studying college wizard could possibly look. I learned about the arena where most of the PvP in the game takes place, and at this point I was around level 12 when I found that walking through this waterfall leads me to Nightside, the hidden death school where later on I could learn more and more powerful spells. Before, eventually, I found the World Gate. No, literally, this just takes you to an entirely new world. I traveled to an Egyptian-themed world with pharaohs and tombs and mummies and sphinx, with apparently its whole own entire storyline completely separate from the Wizard City world that I was just in prior. To be honest, I was beginning to wonder how this game would scale, as it seemed I had already visited plenty of the available areas in the Wizard City world, and I was only level 12. But it seems through this World Gate is how the game really opens up and leads to new storylines and areas with new bosses and dungeons. So, this was a pretty exciting moment. The questing here seemed to be ever slightly more difficult, but it also seemed the experience was coming in faster as well. I got myself a new temporary mount, a camel, and I also learned about the spell writing system, where essentially you gain copies of a spell card, and once you reach 75 of those, you can upgrade your card, so its base damage and stats are more powerful. I got so many more rewards for fighting bosses and monsters in this area. This one boss completely filled up my loot notifications, and there was way more items dropped beyond what's just being shown here. Within a few hours, I was already level 14 and quite enjoying myself. The questing throughout Wizard101 is admittedly repetitive. Basically, kill a few things, potentially collect an item or two, defeat a boss, repeat. But this new world that I was in seemed more heavily populated, so I was constantly running into battles with other players, both in regular fights and boss fights. At this point, I stumbled across my first dungeon, and decided after reading this warning screen that I better wait for at least one other person to come with me. Eventually, Julia Cursewalker and me braved the dungeon, which had a couple of simple puzzles, a couple of boss fights, and all in all it took maybe 20 minutes to complete, and it got me to level 16. Afterwards, I decided to call it for yet another day and see what Wizard101 had in store for me tomorrow. Day 3. My SoundCloud rapping wizard was looking dope AF, boy. And I made my way into the Hall of Champions, the second sort of arc within this Egyptian area. Where the first temple was fire-themed, this one appeared to be ice-themed. Some players who were wandering by complimented me on my name, which made me feel pretty good. They even went as far as to say that they love me. And eventually we became friends and we were doing some battles together. Unfortunately, they were a bit further along in the story quest than I was, so we had to part ways. Around level 18, I was beginning to understand some of my gear's stats a little bit better. The loot in this place was insane, so I was trying to filter through tens of different pieces of equipment that were all in my inventory. Some will give you defense against a certain school of magic, while others will boost your strength with a certain school of magic. So I tried to prioritize boosting the strength of my death magic spells. Then my once little baby cat had finally grown to a full adult, but still I seriously was hardly using my pet. As I mentioned prior, it's really difficult to constantly keep them well fed, though I did make sure to feed them if I ever encountered a particularly difficult boss fight while solo. But eventually, around level 19, I found myself outside the Vault of Ice dungeon. After waiting for what seemed like about 10 minutes, eventually, another adventurer came along. We decided to brave the dungeon together, and he seemed to have a little bit more know-how and knowledge about the game than me. While fighting the first boss, I apparently completely ruined one of his combos, and he said, "No." I explained that I'm new to the game and I didn't mean to mess anything up, and he explained how he had laid a trap which would turn his death spells into life spells, in order to use one of his really powerful death spells and do a bunch of damage. Mr. Gabriel Soul here promised to help me through the rest of the dungeon, and we talked a bit about how long we had been playing Wizard101. Due to chat restrictions, it was sometimes difficult to exactly type what we were trying to say, but I learned he was from a different, non-English speaking part of the world, and he used to play this game when he was younger, but just recently returned. I actually told him about my YouTube channel, bit of a shameless plug, but he subscribed, and so should you. And everyone in the comments should make sure to say hi to Mr. Gabriel Soul, and once again, good sir, thank you for carrying me through this dungeon. Quite literally. He had a flying dragon mount that could carry the both of us. That was awesome. But no, it was a ton of fun, and so far my entire experience with the Wizard101 community was one of the most wholesome and positive gaming experiences I've ever had in an MMO. As promised earlier on in the video, I would revisit my dorm and decorate the absolute heck out of it. I had acquired so many housing items at this point, from statues and rugs to crystal balls and flags. And honestly, the decorating system is really well done, especially for a game from 2008. I can imagine some of the more rare chase items that you can get for decorating your house later on would be quite impressive. Oh, and also, you're not stuck to just a dorm the entire game. I believe there's other housing options and player-owned spaces that you can acquire later on. Even so, my dorm was pretty packed, but looking pretty good. Anyways, at this point, I was level 20. I had conquered simple foes and intricate boss fights. I had grouped up and made friends with many members of the community. I had learned to fish and decorated my house, but I could tell I was just barely scratching the surface of what's available to do in Wizard101. With that being said, I think I have a firm grasp of what you can expect coming into this game as a new player. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk about some of the issues that are blatant, apparent, and basically unignorable while you're playing Wizard101. Before talking about the positives and why, despite those negatives, this game still boasts an active player base 16 years in the making. So first of all, the game parades itself as free-to-play, but it most certainly is not. The free-to-play portion of the game probably wouldn't even be considered a trial by most game standards. It's absolutely buy-to-play if you want to make any sort of meaningful progress. Secondly, turn-based combat might be a turnoff for a lot of MMO players, especially turn-based combat in which the animations can be quite long and repetitive. I found myself often playing the game as a second monitor game while kinda just waiting for animations to complete. And third, in terms of zones and exploration, the game falls short, as you're placed into these rather smaller areas. Sure, there might be many smaller areas, but in terms of scale, the game and the world, it feels rather small. But with all that being said, Wizard101 was a bit of a surprise to me in terms of how much fun I actually had. It's easy and non-invasive to play with others. Simply joining a fight means you get extra loot. The dungeon will go faster. Another person's presence in almost every activity was welcome. And it does all this while being almost entirely soloable, especially if you actually know what you're doing. While the turn-based combat might not be your thing, if you enjoy turn-based combat, you're going to enjoy Wizard101 immensely. Especially as you get later and later into the game, the combat and deck building strategies can become really rewarding, especially when all sorts of planning for a battle ends up paying off and going your way. Basically, everything in the game is simple enough to understand even for a child, but it can become complex enough that it's fun to play around with. Whether that be what gear you're using, what pet you've built, what spells are in your deck, so on and so forth. Now, something I've mentioned many times in the past, but when jumping into older MMOs, specifically pre-2010, you're often met with a sort of tediousness that comes with the outdatedness of those games. But somehow Wizard101 mostly avoided that experience for me. It was a fairly fluid gameplay experience beginning to end, and I wouldn't mind playing more in the future. Like I said, I just barely scratched the surface here. But as a new player, if you're looking for a fun, new MMORPG that doesn't require a ridiculous amount of input, however is still engaging, I would absolutely recommend Wizard101 in the year 2024, so long as you're willing to pay the $7 monthly subscription. Anyway folks, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the video. Don't forget a like, a comment, a subscription. Those things help a bunch. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider becoming a channel member. But anyways, I'll catch you all in the next one. Later.